If you're shooting a scene where your character is dreaming or hallucinating or maybe they're on drugs, then this video is for you. This week I want to show you a bunch of different ways, both in camera and in editing, to give your footage that dreamy look. Instead of diving straight into filming and editing techniques, I want to start out by talking a bit about setting. And by setting, I don't just mean location. The time of day and lighting conditions that you shoot with are also an important part of your setting. If you want your viewers to feel as if what they're seeing is taking place in a dream or a hallucination, as opposed to the real world, you should be showing them a location that they're not used to seeing in their daily lives. But that doesn't necessarily mean you have to shoot somewhere completely remote. If you get up very early in the morning and go downtown before anyone else is on the streets, then that location is going to feel a little bit out of place and dreamlike. Similarly, shooting with a very strong backlight or filming during golden hour is going to give your footage a bit more of a fantasy or dreamlike appearance. Now let's talk a bit about a few different camera settings that you can use to give your footage a more dreamlike appearance. The first of which is slow motion. Shooting in 60 or 120 frames per second is going to give your footage a bit of a smoother and slower appearance than we're used to seeing in real life. You can accentuate that slow and drifty vibe even further by shooting with a slower shutter speed than you normally would. The lens that you choose to shoot with can also help give you that dreamy look. If you have a lens with a wide aperture like f1.4 or f1.8, then using that is going to give you a shallow depth of field, which blurs out the background, which will just separate your subject a bit from the rest of the world and show us, once again, something that we're not used to seeing in real life. If you want a camera lens that's going to really give your footage that dreamlike appearance, then you can try shooting with a tilt shift lens, which is going to give you some really interesting and dramatic blurring around the edges of your video. Now, if you're like most of us, you probably don't have a tilt shift lens just lying around, so you can try a different technique that doesn't cost you any money, but that might cost you your camera if you do it wrong, and that's called lens whacking, where you basically take your lens, disconnect it from the camera, and shoot like that. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it depending on where you're shooting, but it does give you a really interesting effect with some very dramatic blurring around the edges, as well as some really dramatic light leaks in your video. One more way to get some extra blurring around the edge of your video is to take a bit of Vaseline and just smear it around the edge of your lens, or, well, smear it on a UV filter in front of your lens so that you can clean it off later. Thankfully, we have video editing software, so you don't have to do that. To create a digital blurring effect around the edge of your footage, just make your clip into a composition or composite shot, add a grade or adjustment layer above your clip, and then add a blur effect to that grade. Now draw an elliptical mask on that grade to limit it to the edge of the frame, invert the mask and feather it, and you'll have a pretty solid edge blur effect. However, I'm lazy, so I don't feel like doing all those individual steps, so I'll just drag a zoom blur effect followed by a radial blur effect onto my clip to create an effect that's not quite the same, but close enough for me. An effect you can use that's pretty similar to an edge blur is a vignette, or a darkening around the edges of your footage. Most editing software has a pretty good built-in vignette effect, but if you want to create the effect yourself, just make your footage into a new composite shot or composition, add a completely black plane or solid layer over that, use an elliptical mask on that solid layer, invert it, feather it, set it to an overlay blend mode, and then drop the opacity down. Yeah, just use your software's built-in vignette effect. Save yourself some time. When I'm editing a sequence that I want to look like a dream or a hallucination, one effect that I instantly go to is the RGB split. Now, creating this effect is a pretty lengthy process in itself, so right up here, I'll link a video that I did a while ago all about how you can create that effect. Basically, you just make your footage into a new composite shot or composition, duplicate the footage layer twice, and then use the levels effect to isolate the red, green, and blue channels on each of those layers. Then you set all of those layers to an add blend mode, and then if you change the properties like the scale and position of the individual layers, you'll create some very interesting colored effects. It takes a bit longer than the other techniques in this video, but especially if you're editing a scene where your character is like on drugs or something, I would really consider using this effect. This one might be a little bit obvious, but you can add a glow effect to your footage to give it a more dreamlike appearance. Now, this one's one you should be careful with, because if you take it too far, it can look cheesy very quickly. Finally, you can use color grading to give your footage a more dreamlike appearance. And this is a technique that just has so many different possibilities. There's not one specific thing that you should do with your color grading to make your footage look more dreamlike. Depending on the type of scene that you're filming, you can try shifting the colors around or giving it a crazy tint. It's really up to you depending on your scene. If there's one thing you should take away from this tutorial, it's that it's important to think about all of the different aspects of filmmaking when you're trying to create a specific effect. Sure, you can just throw some heavy edge blur and a heavy vignette on your footage, and people are probably going to associate it with a dreamlike feeling. But if you take the time to think about your location, your lighting, and all the other little elements and aspects that go into it, you can use that to create a truly subtle and very unique effect and really immerse your viewer in that scene. And although that is all for this week's tutorial, last week I asked you all to tell me what your favorite lens was to shoot with. So I'm going to be putting the submissions that I received for that right over here on this side of the screen. But anyway, that is all for this week's video. I hope you learned something from it, and if you did, do feel free to show your support by leaving a like on the video or even subscribing to my channel. I upload 2 new filmmaking and video editing tutorials every single week. Keep creating, and I'll see you in the next one. So I've been filming this video for a solid 40 minutes now. Should have taken me 20, but I could not get the shot to stay in focus and just, And see, look at that, it's out of focus now. Lumix autofocus.